starting now. And so we're really excited to have folks here today. Our objectives for this webinar is to learn more about Massachusetts housing and resources and explore creative housing methods done by local programs in Massachusetts. And today we have Health Imperatives and Respond Inc. joining us, and we're super excited to be hearing from them. They're going to be sharing quite a bit about how they've been able to really do better work in terms of housing and rapid rehousing initiatives through having a housing specialist. So hopefully we'll be able to see any of those similarities between the two programs and also best practices from them as well. And so we have Health Imperatives from Health Imperatives, Breanna, the housing specialist who uses she, her, hers pronouns, and Deals, the shelter manager, she, her, hers pronouns as well. And then later on, we'll be hearing from Respond Inc., Amanda, the chief programs officer, who also uses she, her, hers pronouns. To get us started, we wanted to understand a little bit more about what drew folks to this webinar. So we wanted to ask, and if folks can please respond in the chat box, what is the hardest thing about accessing housing for your clients? Please share that in the everyone chat box, and then also write your name, pronouns, what is your position, and the organization you're from. So there's 5 things, right? Answer this question: your name, pronouns, the organization you're at, and what is your position at that organization. And we'll look forward to hearing from you all in the chat box. Awesome. Okay, so we have someone joining us, Elizabeth Clendon. She, her, hers housing search coordinator at Transition House. That's awesome. So we have another person who is a huge part of this community as well, doing that kind of work. And we'll wait a couple more minutes to see if anybody else will write in and share about what is the hardest thing about accessing housing for your clients. Yes, so finding safe, affordable housing quickly, from Deanne Gomez-Stanley, she, her, hers, domestic violence specialist at SSTAR Women's Center. There just isn't housing or even shelter available for our clients. The qualifying things you need to have in just about everything. It's very true. To know what's available and where to direct them is another person's answer. Yes, so thank you all for answering that. And as more answers come in, we'll continue to address them throughout the webinar. Oh, and the waiting time is the most difficult thing, definitely. I hope that some of our specialists that are going to be joining us here today will be able to answer some of these barriers or offer some ideas to address these barriers throughout the webinar. But if anybody has any further questions at the end, feel free to write them in our question and answer box as well, so we can troubleshoot some of these things. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Deals and Breanna to start their presentation. Please go ahead.
Hey everyone, my name is Dulcie Amado. I'm a Penelope's Place Shelter Manager, a program of Health Imperatives. Next slide.
Hi, my name is Breanna. Today we'll be going over housing specialists, housing intake process, economic training for survivors, and trauma alleviation. Next slide, please.
So I have 9 years of housing experience. I started working for a EA shelter in the greater Boston area. I started as a stabilization worker, which I work with clients that were, after they moved out of shelter into their own apartments. We help with anything that they need, helping them moving out of shelter, and then not getting them set back, getting back to the shelter, back to the shelter. Then I became a case manager working with those clients that are in shelter, helping them get in housing resources, applying for housing. And after I became a program coordinator, which I oversaw the case managers, but because of my language ability, I work with clients too that spoke Spanish, Cuban and Creole, and Portuguese. I have been the shelter manager at Penelope's Place for the past 2 years. When I first started at Penelope's Place, I realized that everyone was doing a little bit of everything, and the length of stay for the clients were longer, and there was less opportunity and resources for victims of domestic violence. Next slide, please. So working with my superiors, we came to the decision of promoting Breanna to become a housing specialist because we felt that it was helpful to have one person have the responsibility of filling out the applications, sending out the applications, working with the clients on a weekly basis, finding resources for the clients, keep tracking of what the client has done, what still needs to be done. And that brought down our length of stay to an average of 4.5 months for each client, but we still have longer stay due to their immigration status in foreign. Next slide,
Yes.
please.
Hi again, my name is Brianna. I'm the housing specialist for Penelope's Place, a program under Health Imperatives. I've been working in the nonprofit world now for approximately 8 years and have been employed with Health Imperatives the last 2 years. In my role, I've been the housing specialist for almost a year. During my role as a housing specialist, my main focus is working with each family, searching for housing options, and completing applications with them for opportunities they are eligible for. We work with each individual based on their needs around their healing from trauma. And what I mean by that is that some residents might not be able to focus on filling out applications, so I fill them out during our meetings. Next slide, please. Next, I'd like to talk about building relationships. It's important to make connections and build relationships with housing authorities. It's helpful when gathering information on what housing opportunities they have available, as well as finding out about what paperwork they require for an application packet. Some places require more documentation than others. For example, Taunton Housing Authority requires a restraining order, police reports, court documentation, medical documents from injuries relating to the domestic violence, and service letters from advocates and counselors. The resident will also be expected to prove they have not returned to the abusive partner and have not been in and out of shelters to get emergency priority for domestic violence.
A tip for those of you guys in the greater Boston area, use Boston Housing Authority. They have a lot of subsidized housing. In my time working in the Boston area, I saw that that was like our main goal too. With the housing authority, the Boston Housing Authority, they have the assistant director of occupancy. She works with individual shelter to help out with all the paperwork that is needed. She helps out with status updates. And also one thing they were doing, I'm not sure if they're still doing, but something you guys can check on. They will train the shelter, someone from the shelter, and because now for Boston Housing, you have to watch a 30 minutes video before you apply to it. So they will train you and give you the video and some applications so you can do it at your shelter, apply with the clients and bring the application yourself.
Some housing authorities have their own applications, so be sure to check online or ask them to send you a copy, such as Malden, Lexington, and Cambridge housing authorities. Also, do keep note about what wait lists are open and what is closed, so not to waste time, money, and energy sending applications to them. Next slide, please. Next, I would like to talk about the priorities. There are different priorities which may help residents have a better placement on the wait list for an apartment so the wait time is reduced. First is the emergency priority. In order to apply for emergency priority, you would need to include a restraining order, police reports, medical documentation to injuries from abuse, service letters from community agencies, and court documents, etc. Also, minority. Canton Housing Authority does give minority priority, but I also have not seen other housing authorities do that. It is good to check with different housing authorities on what priorities they give. For disabilities, medical documentation such as SSI or SSDI letters required. For those who are veterans in the shelter, they would need to include a copy of the Veterans Department of Defense Form DD-214 will need to be submitted. And also the city or town of residence, you will need to include a proof of letter from the shelter, such as if you're living in Boston, you will get preference in Boston. And same as if you're working in Cambridge, for example, you'll get preference in Cambridge. You would also need to include, next slide, please. Next, I'd like to talk about the documentation. In order to apply to each housing authority, you need to submit an emergency DHCD application. If you have the required documents to back it up, you also need the DHCD universal application. Every section needs to be completed thoroughly. If something does not apply to an individual or family, write not applicable or NA. You also need to include a photo ID for all members of the household 18 years and older, such as license, state ID, green card, or passport. Some places require copies of both front and back of the green card for each individual in the household, including children. Who has a green card, please provide it with the application. You also need copies of birth certificates for all members of the household, social security numbers for all members of the household. You also need a 5-year housing history. Please make sure that there are no gaps in the housing history and provide as much information as possible. Also include proof of income, such as the last 2 paychecks. If biweekly, last 4 weekly. TAFDC needs to be within 90 days, SSI within 6 months. You also need to complete a housing search form. Each housing authority requires for the person to look for reasonable accommodation. Have the client call different apartments, fill out the housing search form with a name, phone number of the person called, and why the apartment won't work for them, such as, example, the apartment costs $2,400 per month and they can't afford it because their income is only making $500 a month, for example. You also need to include Declaration of Residency form, Fair Information Act form, copies of restraining orders, police reports, court documents such as letters from the victim witness advocate or a letter from the court with the charges against the abusive partner.
Please. Next slide, please.
Also need to include homeless verification form, proof of address letter, references from case managers, counselors, DV advocates, therapists, and psychiatrists. Some housing authorities require a written narrative stating what happened, why it happened, what did the resident do to prevent it from happening, and how the resident got to where they are now. Not every housing authority requires this, but I recommend it be done for every application sent. Some housing authorities will send the whole application back or parts of it if the application is not complete or does not have all the necessary documents. Make sure that each client has all the required documents that pertain to them and the application is completely filled in with all of the information before sending out the applications. Each resident should have an individualized housing plan based on their current circumstances and needs. I suggest that keep a copy of the master application packet with all required documents and updated as needed, such as household composition, income, and address. Do not sign it and date it, so multiple copies of the application can be made and sent out. Encourage residents to keep each place they have applied to updated their household composition, contact information, including address and phone numbers and income. If the residents do not, they will be removed from the wait list. Keep a housing log of where residents apply and when they are mailed out. Also follow up with housing authorities to find out about status updates. I also have a suggestion. Use a binder for each individual family with a copy of the master application, copies of housing receipts, and the housing log to stay organized. I cannot stress enough how important it is to provide all the documentation to prove each priority the applicant is applying for.
Next slide. Because of my language ability, I worked with a lot of undocumented residents. And one of the things that I learned while helping them applying for housing is that with the state subsidized housing, they pay 30% of their income. But with the federal housing, they pay 50% of the market rate. So usually what I do with anyone that doesn't have legal status, I only apply for the state housing because with the federal housing, they have to pay 50% of market rate. If a 2-bedroom is $2,400, they have to pay $1,200, which we all know that our clients might not have that much money to pay for it. So one recommendation is for undocumented residents just to apply for the state housing. Next slide, please. Another thing that when I first started, we looked at it is that if we're trying to apply for housing, we try to do it in the first month that someone comes into shelter. And It's unrealistic for us to ask a client to send out about 80 applications or more, whatever they choose to send out, because we gave them a list of all the housing authorities and asked them to choose where they feel safe to move to. So what we came up with is a budget for the shelter so we can help sending out the applications. We work with clients that has no income. We send out all their applications regardless of how many applications it is. With clients that has income, we work with them, set up a budget where we send out the first few applications, about 20, 30 applications, and then they set out 10, and then we do send out another 60 or whatever applications we have, but we work with them so they can see that, try to get a budget with themselves. They know that they have to have that budget there for once they move out of shelter.
For the residents, we use a budgeting worksheet with every resident so they can visually see and track what they're spending versus what they're saving. We encourage the clients to save money towards future housing costs and other expenses. Housing authorities expect tenants to pay 30% of their income every month plus utilities. We work with the residents to set goals such as opening a savings account, checking account to save money. We also have a local bank come in and do a financial literacy workshop with the clients. Housing and economics coincide with one another. Having them work on their financial goals, it sets them up for success and will minimize setback. We also help the client obtain their credit report and calling the company to negotiate any payment plan to help improve the credit, because some housing authorities will check credit history.
So with my time working with the housing and budgeting with the clients, we saw that some residents, they don't save. With the EA shelter, it's a requirement that they save 30% of their income so they can start paying for when they get into housing. Some clients didn't save that, so when they got into their permanent housing, it was a big reality check that they had to pay that 30%. So we work with our clients here to help them realize that once you get to your own apartment, you have to pay that 30%. So if you want to save it, why don't you start saving it now? So once you get there, it's not a big thing, a big reality check for you. Next slide, please.
Next, we'd like to talk about furniture. DTA gives $1,000 of relocation money. We work with CL Furniture to get the clients the basic furniture for them to move, such as beds, kitchen tables, and chairs. Their contact information is as follows. CL Furniture, LLC. Their phone number is 857-251-1465. Their email address is clfurniture@outlook.com. Do keep in mind when residents get an offer of placement into an apartment that most furniture banks in the state require a referral from a case manager or a staff person and a list of what items the resident needs for their apartment. Please contact the furniture bank in the area your client is relocating to find out more about their policies and procedures. Most furniture banks do not deliver to the apartment and expect residents to have the proper vehicle and assistance needed at the time of pickup. Also, check out the Salvation Army area to see what they're able to provide.
Another resource that wasn't available to our clients but are available now is the home base. They also offer $1,000 for furniture, and it's something that we can look into it, moving our clients out of shelter.
We keep in touch with residents after they move out for any support they might need.
Next slide. So is there any questions that anyone has in regards to the mailing applications and anything in regards to our length of stay?
So if anyone has any questions, they can feel free to put some in the group chat to start us off. I was wondering actually if you all could talk a little bit more about how the process of getting to the 4.5 months as your average for the length of stay. How long did it take you all? What were you seeing before, and what were you seeing recently that has made that change really stick and stay around?
So as I said, when I first started, the length of stay was longer. So I saw that if we actually send all the application, a complete application with everything needed during the first month, it's easier for them to get a call in for a screening, because once they get that application, they have everything. So that person is going to on the wait list, a complete application. But if they don't have a complete application, it's going to get sent back, And when it sends back, when you send it back and then fill it out and send it back again, that's going to take your time on the wait list. So if you send out all the applications you can in the first month, the wait time for them to get called in for a screening is less than that. It doesn't mean that all our clients are here for 4.5 months. That's an average. But I've had clients that were here for 3 months that got offer housing.
Wow.
So yes, and then usually it's between 4.5 to 6, but the average is 4.5 months.
Wow, that's amazing. That's really great. And so we have two questions that came in via group chat. We have one that says, any suggestions for community-based programs where not a residential program?
Well, housing, I think it's if they actually, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be in shelter in order to apply for housing. It just might not be able to get the homeless priority, but you can get the DV priority if you have all the documentation to support it. You can get the residence priority in that city where the person is located.
So is your recommendation to really go into the priorities for each area that the person could potentially, qualify for?
Yes, just because a victim of domestic violence, they get the homeless priority being in a DV shelter, but the other priorities is they have the restraining order, they have the police report, so they can still apply for the housing.
Yeah, definitely.
It might be longer, but it's a possibility.
Yeah, thank you. And then we have another question. Are there designated furniture assistance locations?
I know that in the greater Boston area, they have a furniture bank, and it's all on the mass.gov, the furniture information. And like for the South Shore, we use My Brother's Keeper. And as we said, we use CL Furniture. I used to work them at my old job, and they're really good about meeting our clients where they're at, because most furniture companies not going to deliver, for example, to Worcester.
Yeah.
And CL Furniture has been doing stuff like that to us, to Worcester, Springfield, Norwood, all around the state. So that's why we use them.
Wow, that's amazing. That's really great. That's a good resource. And I can definitely send that out as well. And then we have another question. How do I, as an advocate, find out where are the housing specialists in the client's areas so I can connect with women all over Massachusetts as I connect with women all over Massachusetts?
Well, that's a tricky question, because the housing specialist, like for right now, Breanna is the housing specialist for Penelope's Place, so she helps the victims that we serve. But if anybody calls on the phone, she can also give them tips on how to fill out applications and where to go, which housing authority has open wait lists.
Yeah.
All that information, and she's able to give it if someone calls our hotline. But in regards to finding a housing specialist in the area, I couldn't say like where you would go, because I don't know if other community-based program might have a housing specialist or not. Some might, but some might not.
Yeah, definitely. And so maybe that is also something that you all, I know that Kay Sullivan Brewer is the one who asked this question. If you wanted to contact me directly, then we could try to figure out who are the ones in different areas and try to figure that out for you as well, for any consults you might need. So I think that's it for questions from the folks who have sent me questions. Was there anything else that you all wanted to add? Oh, and we had someone write in, I am the housing specialist in Holyoke, Massachusetts for Women's Shelter Compañeras, who is Tanya. And so if folks wanted to get in touch with that person as well, then we could figure that out too. So thank you so much, Dilce and Breanna, for doing that.
Thank you so much.
And so we'll be going into response portion of this webinar. And if folks have any other questions later on, then they can always ask them at the end of the presentation as well. So thank you so much, you all, for being a part of this. Awesome. So Amanda, I'm going to start handing it off to you.
Awesome. So hi, I'm Amanda Reichmuth. I'm the Chief Programs Officer at Respond. Our office is in Somerville, but we serve a large portion of Middlesex. We have a housing specialist. Her name is Kiana, and she became unavailable for this portion of the training. So I am here to provide the information that I have, and if there's any specific questions, I'm happy to link folks up with Kiana as well. And to kind of also go to the last question, I think a lot of agencies may or may not have a housing specialist, but they probably have someone in the agency who they kind of go to. So I would think that the best thing to do would be to call the hotline that seems to be in that area and just see what those experts are doing there and how they might be able to help out your survivor, however they've reached you. So that's my 2 cents on that. So I've been at Respond for 2 years. Kiana's been at Respond almost as long. And we've both been doing this type of work in various avenues for a number of years. Kiana's become our housing specialist November of last year. It's a growing program that we have. We got funding through the Cummings Foundation to have a specialized person to do housing. And as the speakers before were saying, it really has made a huge difference having one person be the point person. I'll go through more of it in the other slides, but in general, having one person who's knowing what is open and what's closed and all the details of the paperwork that they need to give those priority statuses and things like that has made a significant difference, as well as one person who's focused on that can build connections with landlords, with housing authorities. Not that all advocates aren't skilled at doing those things, but juggling more different areas seemed to make it more challenging for folks to be as successful as one person focusing on the housing work. Next slide, please, Ayana. So this is a general overview of all of our services, including our housing services. So as many of you who are on here, we have our hotline that's 24 hours. So if people have any housing questions, they're welcome to call. If Kiana or I aren't available at that moment, we can always get back to folks with housing questions. And we do do the housing work both in our shelter and in our community office. We do sometimes have slight capacity struggles with the community office, doing the balance between the shelter folks and other folks. But we will do our very best to see people in person or at least get them pointed in the right direction if we can't get them in right away. We have our emergency shelter, we have individual counseling, our case management, our support groups, including one at the Suffolk House of Correction. We do community outreach. We'll talk to anyone who will let us talk to them about domestic violence. And our high-risk teams that are collaborations with the DA's office, police departments, and other community agencies. I'm sure some of the other folks on here have those as well. Educational programs kind of goes hand in hand with our community outreach. We also have teen dating violence education programs that have been really successful. And then civilian partnerships, we're currently in Malden, Melrose, and Wakefield police departments. So if you know folks who are needing housing work and are in those areas, we may be able to meet them closer to home as opposed to coming to Somerville. And we also can do like FaceTime meetings and things like that if that's helpful for people. But sometimes for the housing applications, there's no, not quite as good as seeing the application in person so that we can review it and make sure it's really going to hold muster with the housing authority or with the program. And then safety planning, information, and referrals, as I'm sure all of you who are on here do as well. Next slide, please. So specific housing concerns that we're always thinking about, or Kiana is thinking about when we are meeting with folks, is that the places that they're looking at feel safe for them, and that we sometimes are helping, you know, if you're going to this place, or is your bus going to have to go through that area that feels unsafe? All of those safety conversations that are different than other folks that might do housing work. The documentation, as the part talked about, is really critical. And another reason that having one person do it has been so much more successful, because she knows exactly what they're looking for. She's done enough applications, had enough conversations to know what aspects are going to be helpful. And we have most of our survivors, if they don't have like court documents or restraining orders, to do up a self-declaration of what has happened and how that affected their housing. so that has been helpful in the applications for the housing authorities. Knowing the availability. We do a lot of applications, of course, for housing authorities. We've also done for clients who have jobs or have a higher income, not high, but higher, have done some work with agencies that can assist with pieces of the rent, like Just a Start or home-based or things like that, that help people who have a plan to increase their income obtain and maintain that housing while they're working on those things to increase their income and take over that rent in the future. And that, of course, has a few steps then. We're applying them for the program and then helping them find the actual apartment that they're going to use the voucher. And that, again, is an area where it's really helpful to have one point person who's talking to landlords, looking at apartments in appropriate price ranges, and maybe it doesn't work for client A, but it could be a good option for client B. And so it keeps that apartment and that landlord who are willing to look at taking a voucher in the mix and not necessarily, kind of starting from scratch over and over again. Sometimes it doesn't work for anyone, but it helps streamline a little bit those pieces. And we also have right now some rapid rehousing money that's specific through Somerville, so it's only for folks from Somerville. But for the folks that it works for, it helps us pay first, last deposit. For other folks, we're working with other agencies, but it's been really great when we're the holder of that, so we can kind of monitor the amount of time it's taking for that to happen and the relationship with the landlord in that interim time. So also partnering with other agencies that have those move-in costs for those other folks has been really important in maintaining a good rapport with them so that they can feel comfortable to write those promissory notes or giving us permission to write those promissory notes to the landlord so that the landlord doesn't lose confidence in the survivor as well as in the agency. Kiana also goes out to a lot of the apartments with folks, at least the first couple, to help folks get comfortable about what questions to ask, how, what to look for what things are important to them. But we also try to encourage survivors to go by themselves when they are comfortable, because sometimes landlords aren't a fan of people having other people with them and are wondering why this other person needs to be there. So it's a balancing act. But as long as that, the first couple of times, if the survivor would like it, we're always happy to go with them to help them navigate what's a tricky process, even when you haven't had this relatively recent trauma. So client need, I talked about some of those things. Financial capacity. So housing authorities may be an option for the folks with less income. People with a little bit more income may have and have kind of future plans to increase their income that are pretty imminent, increasing their income, may be good fits for some of those programs that help, but then terminate at some point the assistance. And status. So meaning immigration status, or also kind of status of past housing. There's a lot of things that can get in the way. And who wants to share all their information like when you're first meeting somebody either? So it's a process of building rapport with survivors, as we all do in all the aspects of our work, and letting them know the reason we want to know these things. Like, we need to know if there were evictions because we want to be able to help you mitigate those things when you're talking to landlords, if you're talking to the housing authority. If it was because of domestic violence, we may be able to get documentation that shows that it was because of domestic violence, and then we can get over that hurdle. As they talked about in the past, presentation credit is also can be a huge issue. And immigration status can be a huge stumbling block for folks. I have a future slide about that, so I'll just pause on that piece for now. Could I have the next one, please? So we have purchased HousingWorks. It's pretty inexpensive, but it's a web-based system that holds a lot of the housing authority applications and availability and what's open. So if someone has a housing specialist or wants to designate, you have to pay like per person who's utilizing it. So not per agency, but per human being who is the staff person utilizing it. So if people are interested, I would recommend looking into it. They were really happy to answer all of our questions when we tried it out. And it's been, what I've been hearing from our housing specialists is that it's been really helpful in both knowing what's open, being able to access applications, and being able to see people's what they've already applied to. Not all housing authorities participate, but the ones that do, you can look in on what people's status are, and they have like a form letter to update as well, people's new address or other changes that need to be updated. And again, as I mentioned in the previous one, it's super important that people update real ways to be reached. They could come up on a housing authority that they applied to while they were in shelter with us or while they were in some other program. But if they don't get that letter, the housing authority is happy to move on to the next person. They have a lot of folks waiting. So really important to have conversations with folks about where they applied, if they're not sure, calling places to find out so that they can update those things. We also work with other community agencies around resources that they have that may be specific to different communities or different places that people have lived. CCAN, I have on another slide, but folks who have been connected, have a connection to Cambridge, may be able to access services there, and they have some of their own, they work with Just a Start, which can help pay some amount monthly and move-in costs, and can work with folks who don't have documentation or citizenship in the United States. So we discovered that recently, and we're super excited about that. And also they've been a good resource to kind of collaborate with as well, since we're pretty close to Cambridge. Housing authorities with the emergency application, which I won't reiterate everything that's already been talked about. Other low income units. So sometimes there's things that aren't housing authorities, but are low income or lower cost. So kind of we're on a few different like email lists and things like that, or just talking to different people and finding out what's open. There's a lot of things that aren't centralized. So a lot of it is really building relationships and getting those folks on your side who will let you know when something opens up in their city or their town or different places like that. Rental assistance agencies, again, like RAFT. We have some, like I said, for domestic violence survivors specifically who are homeless in Somerville. And then transitional housing, which, as we all know, has gotten much fewer and far between. But we do apply for that for folks who feel like that would be helpful for them, and for folks who it's applicable for, like Second Step and other programs like that, or if people have specific needs. If someone is also struggling with substance recovery, there may be some additional housing options that are available to them because of that struggle that they've been through and that support that they want and need. There may be sober houses or things like that, which may work for them. Also considering the family size. For folks with children, we've had much quicker movement for the housing authorities versus folks without children. So for folks without children, there's fewer of these are also available to them. So it's a lot more getting creative with them around what are options that may be available that they have that are part of their community that, you know, may not be kind of the standard things that we go through. Or some of the YWCAs have some housing, so we'll look into that. They do have kind of lengthy lists, but it's all about looking at what works for this family or this individual, and not doing those applications that don't kind of make sense for folks. We've recently had some success working with QCAP as well in Quincy for some folks. So it's a little hard to kind of make it succinct because there is so much individuality around where someone is looking and what someone's bringing with them. Also, if folks have like severe health issues or disabilities, there may be specific resources as well for that, or mental health concerns. If they're diagnosed, then there may be some additional resources for them through that set of housing as well, as long as that's safe for people. That's an avenue we've gone down as well for folks. And then market rate housing. Some survivors are going to be able to afford market rate housing, but helping folks to find what is going to be reasonable and maintainable for them, and if possible, move-in costs so that they can get started off on the right foot. And then all the things that the other folks talked about, the furniture items. We provide continued ongoing case management as people want or need when they've moved out of shelter, or if they never were in shelter, from our community office. If they get rehoused, we're of course always happy to continue working with them. And that's actually something we have been ramping up since we have had more success getting people into housing more quickly. There's more of a need for that, how to maintain your housing, how to get used to your new neighborhood, all of those pieces that are different from where they were before they came to us. So being open to having those conversations with folks and game planning with folks. Now you're in this new place and it's just you and your kid, or just you, and you have some free time. So what are some things that you are interested in, want to do, so that you can maintain that and don't kind of feel lost and fall back into something that is unsafe or feels comfortable but may not be safe. Next slide, please. Completing the emergency application, just some quick updates also on what they said. It's important to never leave anything blank. You leave it blank, they think you haven't looked at it. So like they said, put not applicable if it's something that doesn't apply. Always feel free to call them and ask questions before you're submitting any application if you're unclear, and apply with all of the supporting documents unless it specifically states not to. So over documenting is much better than under documenting. It's also super important to be truthful, which is an important conversation that we have with our clients. You know, that there may be that eviction on your record or that credit issue, and they're going to find out. So it's important that we're truthful in the beginning, and we can give mitigating documentation or explain why that happened. But more often than not, if you haven't been truthful, they're going to then wonder what else has been going on, and it could deter them from accepting you into the housing, or could cause you not to be accepted. And a lot of the housing authority information gets shared between housing authorities around people being rejected, so it could affect not just that one location. So super important to give people that. Of course, survivors get to decide what they do with that information, but that we're giving them that information so that they can make the best decision for themselves about how they fill out those applications. Next, please. Self-documenting, I mentioned briefly. We ask folks to collect as much documentation as possible. It can be really hard for people and really triggering to have to go to the courthouse and ask for documentation of those things, or go to the police department and ask for the incident report. So we do as much support around that as we can, but it really does make a difference in the application. And survivors can also write a written statement about the danger and the domestic violence and have it notarized. And that is accepted by a lot of the housing authorities in lieu of other documentation if it doesn't exist. If it does exist, I would strongly recommend that people gather it. But if they didn't make a police report, they didn't get a restraining order, that doesn't mean the abuse didn't happen. And that self-declaration with the notary often is accepted, especially if they also have a letter that says that they are working with a domestic violence agency. Of course, we can't verify what happened to them, but we can say, yes, they are working with us. These are the things that we're providing, things of that nature. So including a third-party verification, if possible, if they're homeless, whether they're homeless in our shelter or homeless and working with another homeless services agency that can verify that can be really helpful. And if they're staying with us, we would, of course, provide a letter of that. Or if they're working with us, just a letter saying that they're coming to support group or coming to case management or whatever the case may be. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I mentioned this already, but CCAN is a multi-service center with Cambridge, and they work with folks who are homeless or at risk of homelessness, regardless of immigration status, but they do have to have a Cambridge connection. They have been relatively flexible around what that connection is. So if someone has some sort of connection, I feel like it's worth giving them a call and checking in to see if that would work or not work. I don't know. They don't seem to have a hard and fast rule on what that connection should look like. Next, please. Okay, relationship with landlords. Also mentioned this as well. I always get ahead of myself on these things. So it's super important to keep communication open, be responsive to the landlords. They are, right now housing is like moving really fast. So you are competing with people who may have cash to move into that unit and things like that. So it's super critical that you're responsive and appreciative of their time, even if it feels kind of over the top. Some of that's going to go a long way in helping move things along for the survivor. And also, some survivors want to share their story with landlords, some don't. So having some conversations with clients about what they're comfortable with and what might actually be detrimental. Some landlords are concerned about safety in their unit. So maybe less is usually more, unless they seem like a bleeding heart kind of person, then maybe you want to talk about that a little bit more. But generally speaking, less is more. So just saying, that they need a new place, they came upon hard times, or they may just say briefly that there was domestic violence, but they are moving here to be safe, kind of what feels comfortable for the survivor. They don't owe the landlord anything to say that they are a survivor of domestic violence. For housing authorities, they kind of have to share that information if they want the priority. But for individual landlords, they definitely don't. And I think the vast majority of the time, less is more, and more talking about their strengths and what they're going to do and their job or their education plan and those things that give the landlord that sense of security that someone is going to be responsible with their unit and is going to pay rent. Landlords are more business folks than social work folks, usually. And if apartment doesn't work for one client, it may work for another, which we already mentioned. Keeping an up-to-date portfolio, the other folks already talked about that, but it's important to also check frequently for open and closed wait lists. You can pass by that. Keeping track and following up. If you haven't heard from a landlord who said they were going to call you, don't be shy about calling them. Give them enough time for them to get back to you. But like I said, you're competing with a lot of other folks. They have most often a lot of people who are eager to move into that place, especially if it's a lower cost place. So being proactive is super important, both for you and the survivor. If the survivor is comfortable doing it, I think it's awesome for the survivor to be the one calling and making those contacts. So then your part is checking in that they did do that follow-up. Like, how did it go? How did that conversation feel? Things like that. And some survivors may feel less comfortable, so that may fall more on the staff. And that's kind of up to your personal, your relationship with that client. Ongoing support, like I mentioned, our services continue. We at Respond, and I think this may vary from some other folks' programs, but there is no set amount of time that people receive services with us. It's really survivor determined. Certainly if we're concerned about someone and we haven't heard from them, we may do more reaching out, but generally speaking, it's up to the survivor how long they want to receive services. The only caveat of that is if we do provide the financial support for move-in, then we have a 6-month case management timeline to make sure that sticks. But we're always happy to provide as much support as people are open to, and connect people, like I said, with things in their new community. Like, they could move somewhere very far from here. So we may not be the best resource. Maybe another agency is going to be the best resource and they give us a call once in a while. Or they don't want to think about the domestic violence anymore, but they do want a supportive community. So maybe there's a club that they can join, or an organization, or a knitting group, or I don't know what, but something that interests them individually that they're going to feel supported by and start making new connections. And rebuilding some old ones potentially that may have been damaged by the domestic violence. Final slide. It's very tiny, but this is our phone number. Also, Jane Doe has all our information, and the SafeLink number. But do feel free to give us a call or email if you have any questions. It is so much individualized, but hopefully some of those things are helpful, pointing in the right direction. And as the prior folks said as well, we do some budgeting work and financial literacy and education and working with people's credit. We have a donor / volunteer who works with us on some of those things. And that's been really helpful for folks, both kind of recognizing their own ability to save and budget, which may have felt out of reach before, and also some tools and techniques to help maintain that housing and paying rent to make sure that that gets paid so they can stay there and work on those other pieces.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all of that. And then Brianna and Deals, if you all want to join us again, we can move on to the questions portion and see if anybody else has any questions for folks. It was very cool to be able to see that there were actually a lot of similarities in the ways that you all did your work, which goes to show how you all have been able to be doing work where you're able to get survivors secure and in housing a little bit faster than before, which is really awesome. I'm going to be posting in the everyone chat box a link to our survey. If folks can please fill out that survey so that we can know what you all are looking for in terms of the different webinars, different workshops that you would like to have. This is a great place to be able to gather that. So it's SurveyMonkey link, so if you all can go there, it's anonymous. And while folks are filling that out, if we can take any more questions that people may have. Also, if you all have questions for each other, Amanda and then also Diaz and Brianna, in terms of the work that you all are doing, that I think that would be great as well. So we'll take a couple moments for that to work out. Okay, so we will be sharing the PowerPoint presentation later on. It will be as a PDF, and we'll be sending it to the participants later on. So one of the questions that I actually had for both of you all as well is both of you all talked a little bit about making relationships with different organizations, also the different housing departments as well. How do you all go about that? How do you even get started in that relationship making process?
I feel like for the most part, it's kind of just making some calls, asking some questions, getting that person's name, and kind of continuing in that relationship.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're all, I feel like most of us being case managers and things like that are pretty good at relationship building. So it's remembering that those folks are kind of the pathway for our survivors. And if you all have other...
Well, I think it's the same too, especially when they do call in for a client and they need something. It's always good to keep the name of that person and give them what they need. And because they're going to call back and then they're going to know you by first name.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like how we start building up relationship. We even call in to ask for status. We always ask who we're talking to. And when we call for a second time, they say, it's Brianna from Penelope's Place.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and being really responsive, because if you burn that bridge, it's really hard to rebuild those things. So being responsive and being clear on like, I'm working on getting this, but this is the barrier. So like just giving that realistic expectation as well.
Another thing that we do, we actually drive our clients to their housing screen, and we meet that person so they can put a name, a face to the name.
Yeah, we do that as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much. And Amanda, I know you also talked about different like email lists that you're a part of as well. How do you find these in the first place to be able to kind of incorporate that?
I've found them through my case managers mostly. Someone stumbles upon something, and then we join onto it. I think they've been through different like postings for some sort of housing, and then there was something like find out more, and so getting onto the lists that way, which which was probably not super helpful for the crowd, but.
Like, do they usually say, like, you know, like cheap housing, or is that kind of the housing list that you're talking about, or is it just?
So there's a Boston one that sends emails pretty often about things, but I don't remember the name of it right now. And then that one has had links to other like towns or things like that. So I could try and find that later for you.
That's great, thank you. And then, awesome. So somebody wrote, the Metro list is helpful. That's
Yep, that's it.
Awesome. There we go. Cool. That's awesome. So I think, you know, one of the things that I'll be doing after this too is sending out different resources that have been listed throughout this webinar, along with the PDF and the survey as well. And so if folks want to take a look at all of those things, then they're welcome to. It looks like we don't have any other questions. Do you all have anything else that you'd like to add?
I didn't talk about project-based Section 8, but I know that a lot of housing authorities, they do have it. For example, MBHP, Metropolitan Boston Housing Partnership, they do have a lot of project-based Section 8. Housing Solution in the South Shore, they do have a lot of those. And another thing too is like housing lotteries. A lot of the development properties, they have housing lotteries, and we actually do apply for our clients for those too.
Yes.
That's
another specific resource that I learned of recently is Caritas, and they are just for single folks. You do have to have income, and I'm not remembering the level of it, but they do seem to readily have openings if it is a fit for folks.
Wow.
So it's Caritas.
Okay, yeah, it's 1,500 per month, I think, for.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, for chiming in.
So fast.
Yes, that's great. So thank you all so much for being a part of this webinar. I definitely learned a lot in terms of what are some of the best practices, and just being able to see, you know, two different organizations who have a housing specialist, and what you've been doing in terms of that has been really, you know, educational for me. And then also just thinking about what are best practices in terms of getting survivors, especially when housing has been super hard lately, even more so and increasingly so, right? And so hopefully continually we can continue working together and figuring out more ways that we can kind of address those barriers that exist throughout the whole state of Massachusetts. So thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who joined us today. Hopefully we'll be able to see you for the next webinar as well. All right. Bye.
Bye.